Okay. Here we go. Like I said, the website is at woodlandinfo.org. If you click on under Woodland Workshops, there's a Learn About Your Land link. When you click on that page, you'll see all of the other classes that we're offering in person. We have a number of in-person classes and then the Internet Series class. If you click on that link, you'll get to see all the information about the other classes that are there. And you can access some of the publications that we have identified for that particular topic, and we'll be posting the, like I said, a link to the recorded presentation and the question and answer session will be underneath each one of these topics. So for the assistance with your woodlands, the links will be underneath that section. Okay, the last part of this is if you haven't used the questions log yet, that's how we're going to be offering you an opportunity to pose questions to the speaker. You'll be entering your question in this part here, and then you hit send, and that question will come to me, and I'll pose it to Jamie, where she can answer it. You can do that throughout the presentation, or you can wait till the end when we'll have some more time to answer questions. Before we get started on the presentation, I'd like to ask you to fill out, actually to respond to this poll that I've just posted. If you please indicate your preference. The last session in our series, we have a choice of presentation. It'll be on either on insects and diseases or firewood production. So indicate your preference by choosing one of those. Your vote matters, which presentation you'll be seeing in the last session. Just a few more seconds. Just about everybody has voted. And I apologize again for the technical difficulties. This is a new technology for us, and we're learning as we go along. And so there's going to be some problems that crop up. Hopefully, luckily, they haven't been too severe, just some inconveniences here and there. All right, I'm going to close this poll. And I got another poll for you about your level of knowledge in regards to managing your woodland for wildlife. Please indicate your preference. Just about everybody's done. I'll share the results from this poll so you can see kind of where you are in relation to everybody else. And in fact, it's looking like most folks are about the same in the way of level of knowledge. Let me share the results with you, which is good for us because we've designed this particular session for people with, as an entry level, just kind of learning what you can do about managing for wildlife. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Jamie, and she can begin her presentation. All right, take it away, Jamie.
Chris, there's one more poll that needs to be answered, and then
thank you. I thought we were going to wait. Okay. Thank you, Chris. Just a few more seconds. Actually, that's just about everybody. All right, we'll close the poll. And now, Jamie, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, Bill and Chris, thanks for inviting me to present at this webinar. My name is Jamie Knack. I'm a Wildlife Outreach Specialist in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about wildlife and managing particularly woodland habitat for wildlife, although some of the principles that we'll be talking about are certainly relevant for other habitat types like grasslands and wetlands and so on. So the outline I'm going to cover for today, we'll talk about principles of wildlife management, and then we'll talk about some specific management for your woodlands in terms of habitat management that will benefit wildlife species. And then I will leave you with some resources that you can pursue to obtain more information or more in-depth information either about individual species that you're interested in attracting or just management principles in general. So before we start talking about managing habitat for wildlife, let's talk a bit about what the Wisconsin Wildlife Resource Base consists of. So in my department, when I do extension work for wildlife, I'm in the Wildlife Ecology department here, we talk about 4 different groups of animals, and they all are vertebrates. There's a 5th group of vertebrates, the fishes, but there's a separate major degree program for fish, the study of fish, ichthyology. So we're going to focus on birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And to get an idea of how many of different species of each of these groups of animals there are, I put those numbers on the screen there. You see for birds, we have more birds than any other species or group of species, between 300 and 400. So why the range? Well, birds migrate. So on the lower end of that range are resident birds that are here year-round, and in fact about 225 or so birds are here year-round and actually nest in Wisconsin. Some of the birds that we see or are included in that 400 are the migratory birds that are simply passing through, and then every now and then we get a rare bird that isn't necessarily you know, maybe not in the correct habitat, or gets blown in on some thermals or because of a storm that's coming through. So there's some unusual encounters that we have from time to time. So 300 to 400 bird species in the state, depending on the season. For mammals, there's quite a fewer species of mammals, about 72 plus or minus a few. Depends if you count moose, which occasionally will venture into very northern Wisconsin. Depends if you want to count mountain lions. We have had one documented case of a mountain lion in Wisconsin relatively recently. Otherwise, they haven't been in the state for decades, but it depends if you add them to the list or not. Wolverines are another species. They've been extirpated. We haven't had wolverines in Wisconsin for over 100 years, and yet it depends if you include extirpated mammals on that list. So that's the difference there. If you were to sit down and write a list or come up with a list of the different mammals in the state, you could probably pretty easily come up with 30 or 40, possibly even 50. Where you'll start having difficulty towards the end to get to 72 is because of all the small mammals. So we have 6 different species of shrews. There are 2 different species of moles. We have 8 different bat species in the state. And voles, like the redback vole in the lower left-hand corner, there's 4 different species of voles. So I think there's a number of landowners who aren't necessarily familiar with all of the smaller species of mammals that we have. As far as reptiles, that 35 species is composed of 20 snakes, 11 turtles, and 4 lizards. 4 different lizard species in the state, but they're primarily in southwestern Wisconsin. They're prohibited in their movements because of temperatures, so you won't find them in northern Wisconsin because it's simply too cold. It's a little bit too cold right here in Madison right now too. So amphibians, we have a single toad species, that's the American toad. We have 11 different frogs, and there's about 7 different salamander species. So that's a quick look at the different wildlife species that we have in the state and your opportunity or species to consider to manage for. So starting into the management end of things, and some of the principles. Basically, wildlife management comes down to habitat management. It's the key. It's the philosophy. If you build it, they will come. And there's 4 different critical components to wildlife habitat. So each wildlife species needs food, water, shelter, cover. Those 2 terms are interchangeable. And they need some amount of space. And if even just one of those elements is missing, we would call that the limiting factor. But if even one of those is missing, that species would not be in that habitat, because each of those requirements are essential. So no matter how big or how small the parcel of land is that you own, whether you own 10 acres or you own 400 acres, we use the same principles to attract wildlife. So everything you hear is applicable no matter what the acreage is that you have. So the habitat, or the place where wildlife live, is very critical. Its quality and its quantity will determine the numbers and kinds of animals that can be found on your land. So to break these down a little bit, and I'll go through each of these and give you some tips on what you can do to manage for each one of these. But in general, water is generally not a problem for wildlife species. It is usually not the limiting factor. Wildlife are very adept at getting water from a variety of sources, including surface water, dew, snow at this time of the year, and they can even obtain it through their diet, through succulent vegetation that they might eat. The species that water does pose a problem would be for species like amphibians that are tied to that wetland or moist environment. So water is certainly an issue for those species. But otherwise, it exists somewhere on the landscape, and they're pretty good at finding it and adapting. Space, we only have so much space in the state, in the country, and so on. So it also is usually not a problem, but what you need to keep in mind is that rough grouse that you're seeing on the screen might not utilize your property for all of its space needs. It might also utilize some of your neighbor's property or some state land that you're adjacent to, and so on. So each wildlife species has a different territorial or amount of space that they need to live. So a mouse, well within 1 acre. A pair of rough grouse need at least 10 acres of habitat to survive. So that's how space plays into habitat. The most vital components, and what usually come down to being the limiting factors, and what I'm going to talk about the most in terms of what you can do to increase wildlife on your property, is manipulating the amount of food and the amount of cover that you have on the property. And this is because they have different needs. Each individual animal has different needs for food. For example, deer are going to eat twigs and buds. Songbirds are going to prefer insects and fruits and seeds. They each have a different specific food requirement. And while food is critical to live so they don't starve, cover can be almost as important, if not more important, especially in the winter like we're having now, for surviving. So whether it's a juniper, a clump of juniper that's providing cover, or a hole in a tree, or a brushy fence row, cover is a protective place where an animal can breed, nest, they can rest, feed, or it could be even cover that they use for traveling from one area to another. So another key, and at the bottom of the screen you'll see that habitat diversity. So the more diverse we can make the habitat, will directly increase the wildlife diversity on your property. Another term I wanted to just mention is carrying capacity, and the definition of carrying capacity is the number of each wildlife species the habitat can support throughout the year. The key is that that carrying capacity is without damaging either the animals or the habitat. So Wisconsin's deer herd right now, we had a lower than expected harvest, but many of the management units are still, we have an overabundant deer herd, and we're starting to see some negative issues with, like, the forest understory. The habitat is starting to show some damage. So when animals exceed the carrying capacity, they either start to starve because there's competition for those habitat resources, or the habitat itself suffers. So in general, throughout the year, carrying capacity changes. And if you can imagine, late winter and early spring is when we would have the lowest carrying capacity because there's a lack of food and a lack of shelter, and it's just a very tough time of the year to survive. So we also want to keep that in mind as we work to build shelter and food values, especially in the winter. The good news is that carrying capacity can be increased. You can increase the number of any of the type of wildlife species you're interested in by improving the existing habitat on your property or by creating new habitat.
Jamie,
So now yeah.
could you clarify what you mean by extricated?
Extirpated. Extirpated are animals that used to be in Wisconsin. So the wolverine, before European settlement, was a species that we had in the state, but they are no longer in the state. And it depends on at what point do researchers or biologists decide that they are no longer present, and we take them off of our list. So the wolf was also an animal that was extirpated from the state years ago, and then Minnesota's wolf population started to recolonize and flourish, and we had wolves from Minnesota that actually made their way into Wisconsin and started populations of wolves back in the state. So they're an example of a species that is no longer extirpated. They are populated in Wisconsin. So it's a species that no longer exists in the state. Okay, then starting through some of the habitat requirements, I'm going to start out with food. And again, I can't say it enough, all wildlife species need food, but each individual species, whether you're talking about a grouse, a redback vole, a blue jay, they all have specific dietary needs. So if you're looking to increase the diversity of wildlife, you want to throw out there a whole bunch of different types of food. If you're interested in a very specific species, maybe you're interested in turkeys, you would want to do some research and plant the types of food, provide the type of cover that would benefit turkeys especially. A lot of what I'm talking about is with the idea that you're interested in all sorts of different wildlife. You want a wildlife to be abundant and flourishing on your property. So that's kind of how I'm going at this. But for food, you want to select natural food. So I'm not talking about feeding or artificial food that you might put down or supplements. So you want to select a variety of plants so that food is available year-round. And I'll show that to you on another slide here too. But plants bear fruit and nuts at different times of the year, and you can select plants so that you have some bearing fruit in the fall, some in the spring, and so on. And there's a lot of different types of food. So whether you're talking fruits and berries from shrubs, or grain and seeds, nuts and acorns, lots of different flowering plants that will provide nectar for a variety of species. And that's important. We're not necessarily limiting ourselves to, I mean, the nectar sources, the plants, that's going to bring in insects. Insects are food. Okay, so the animal might not eat the nectar, but it might eat what is eating the nectar. So, and browse plants, forage plants like grasses and legumes, and certainly if you have waterways on your property, there's aquatic plants in there that wildlife will eat on as well. So again, for food, the more diversity, the better. And diversity in terms of the types of trees or shrubs that you plant. Instead of having a monoculture of red pine, if you have a diverse forest with a variety of different tree species, that will also help to protect you against diseases and insect pests. So if you had an infestation of oak wilt, but you had more than just oak trees, you'd be okay. If you think about Dutch elm disease, when we lost all of our elms, you know, if you only had elms in your forest, you wouldn't have a forest anymore. So diversity helps to protect against those aspects as well. I also try to get people to, if they are going to do some planting, whether it's some shrubs or a fence row or shelter belts or it's simply a perennial garden in your backyard, is to select native plants. Try to avoid the non-natives. Native plants are going to be more adapted to the area. They're adapted to the climate, the precipitation, soils, and insects. They're going to be easier to grow, and you'll see more wildlife respond to native plants than the non-natives. They're usually of higher food quality, and provide greater seasonal availability. They're on the landscape longer as well. So try to select native plants whenever possible. So here's an example of some trees and shrubs that you might consider if you're looking to do some planting or to enhance food values by putting in trees and shrubs that wildlife prefer or seek. And these can be birds, these can be mammals, and you'll see for the trees there's cherries that will bear fruit in the summer. The mountain ash holds on to its berries until the fall and even into the winter, so that's providing a much needed food source. Oaks, again, nut trees. And then the shrubs. I put a list of shrubs together there that bear fruit anywhere from early summer and again into the fall and into the winter for sumac. And while they may bear fruit in the fall, they're still hanging on to their fruit in the winter. And again, very important food source for wildlife. In addition to food being in the form of plant material, whether it's berries or nuts and so on, there's other type of food that wildlife are interested in. Some wildlife, whether we're talking about woodpeckers or other birds or small mammals, they're interested in eating insects or invertebrates. So leaving brush piles on your property to attract insects or maintaining some leaf layer will provide insects. In the upper right-hand corner, we've got a dead tree that's standing. We also refer to those, we call them snags, S-N-A-G, snag. And there's a pileated woodpecker just above the drilling that you can see on that tree, and that's pileated woodpecker drumming, marks there where it's been foraging for insects on the tree. And fallen logs, if you have logs that have fallen in the woods, leave them there. They're great habitat. They'll start to rot. They'll return the nutrients back to the soil and help nurture new growth, but also provide places for salamanders and other species to live and a food source for small mammals that might come through. So I was just talking about natural food. I'd be remiss not to talk at least a little bit about artificial feeding, and particularly for birds. Feeding is not necessary for the birds most of the time. It's more something that we as humans do because we like to bring the birds in close or the wildlife in close, and we get so much in return for feeding them. But it's not necessarily something that they need in order to survive. They actually get relatively a small portion of their nutrition from bird seed. And the other thing about putting out bird food is that you're only going to get a specific subset of species. Not all species will come in and eat bird seed. It's going to be the finches, the chickadees, the orioles, the hummingbirds, the grosbeaks, and so on. You're not going to attract all the different species. It's certainly a nice way to view wildlife up close. If you're into photography, it's very nice, but it's not going to bring in a huge diversity of species. And along those lines, a few tips if you are going to feed wildlife. If you can put out more feeders, you will actually reduce aggression between birds, so that can be helpful. It doesn't stress them out as much. And the more variety, there's all different types of feeders, from tube feeders for thistle seed, suet feeders, different styles of more traditional bird feeders, and then all different types of food, from proso millet to black oil sunflower seeds and so on. So if you use a variety of feeders and a variety of food, you'll also increase the diversity of birds coming to the feeders. And it's nice to kind of cluster the feeders together. It gets birds used to coming to that area, and it helps you when you are trying to view the birds as well. And you also want to place feeders near some cover, and we call that escape cover, so that if sharp-shinned hawk or Cooper's hawk flew by that was looking for an easy meal, or the neighbor's cat was lingering, you want to have a place where those birds can quickly flee and get to some thick cover where they can't be seen. So within 10-15 feet, but you don't want to have that cover right underneath the feeder. So if you have a couple thick evergreen shrubs near the yard. You don't want to put the feeder right there because it makes an easy ambush spot for a cat or for another predator to ambush the birds on the feeder. And obviously you want to have the feeders in a nice visible area from your warm house, the fireplace and the recliner, and be able to see them and enjoy the birds. So make sure you can see the feeders from inside. And then it's very important to clean the feeders regularly and watch the birds that come in and make sure that they still look, that they look healthy. There can be diseases that are spread at feeders, so if you start to see a lot of old seed accumulating and kind of clumping up, it's a great idea to get out there and scrape that out. And then you can even use a weak bleach solution, a couple tablespoons of bleach and a gallon of water, and rinse out those feeders, scrub them up real good, and then let them air dry, and then refill them with seed, and do that periodically to keep them clean. Next I'm going to talk about the second habitat requirement, cover or shelter, and this is an important one. The more cover or shelter, or we'll also call it structure, that you can provide on your property will help increase den sites, rest sites for a variety of wildlife, from meadow voles to mice to rabbits, songbirds, and then hunting places for all of their predators, whether it's fox or fisher, or maybe even have a pine marten on your property. So the more structure or cover that you can provide, the more niches you create, leading to a greater diversity of wildlife. So cover and shelter, very important for hiding from those predators, escaping severe weather, and so on. The second bullet there, incorporating vertical diversity for nesting sites, what that boils down to is if you have a forest, instead of just having that upper canopy and all completely shaded and just kind of bare ground on the bottom, a park-like setting, you really want, if you're interested especially in birds and nesting sites for birds, bird species will nest, each species nests in a different place. So for instance, that woodcock on the lower left-hand corner of your screen is a ground nester. It nests in the leaf layer, vegetation layer on the forest floor. So you need to have some sunlight penetrating the forest floor so that there's some nice vegetation on the bottom. And then also birds like robins or cardinals, they're more of a shrub nester. So they nest in the first 10 to 15 feet of the forest in terms of height as we go up to the canopy. And then other species will be more mid-canopy, and some will be in the very peaks of the tree canopy. So incorporating herbaceous layer, a shrub layer, and a tree canopy area within your forest will be important if you're interested in increasing the diversity of songbirds on the property. And other things for cover and shelter, planting evergreens like red cedar, white pine, white spruce, they're really, really important for thermal cover during the winter, especially when we're having the cold spells that we have right now. So evergreens, they collect the snow, and the birds can kind of burrow into those evergreens. Mammals as well, rabbits, snowshoe hares, etc., will burrow into those evergreens and get protected and get out of the wind and hopefully conceal themselves from predators as well. Other examples of cover and shelter, rock piles or stone walls. Upper right-hand corner, there's a nice picture of a rock pile. Years ago, we would see lots and lots of rock fences out in the country where farmers had cleared stones or rocks from their field and piled them up on the field borders. These are excellent, excellent habitat for wildlife, from small mammals to reptiles, and then it's a great place where fox and coyotes and other predators would be scanning or hunting and looking for the prey. So very, very good shelter and cover for wildlife. So if you have some of those, keep them. And if you're clearing fields or creating some food plots or wildlife openings, you might think about piling up some of that rock. Brush piles are another one, and we'll talk about building brush piles in a slide or two here. I did mention the evergreens or dense shrubs. There's a picture in the bottom middle, and you can get an idea or an appreciation of the thermal cover that that provides, and wind blows or tip-up mounds in the lower right-hand corner. They're trees that have fallen over due to wind or other events, and they leave their own little microclimate. Oftentimes where that mound is, there can be a little pool of water when it's in the spring, and wildlife will come and visit and get a drink of water. Sometimes bears will actually excavate that little bit of an area and use that as a den in the fall. So another unique, small but unique habitat feature. And then dead wood. If a tree does die and falls in the forest, our recommendation is to just leave it be. Clear it from the trail if it falls across the trail, but these provide excellent habitat. As it starts to decay, insects will be attracted to it. As it starts to rot and peel apart and leave some cavities, you'll get salamanders. If it's a big enough log, you might have a fox that will den in the log as well. And ruffed grouse will actually perch on logs like that in an open understory and use it for drumming and attracting females. So as we're talking about dead trees, and again talking about the snags, which is a standing dead tree, they're critical. If there was one habitat management thing that you could do to attract wildlife, and I had to pick one, I would tell you to leave trees that are dead standing. If they fall, again, leave them lay. You want to kind of keep a messy woods. Keep that litter and debris lying around. But obviously if it's a safety issue, if it's leaning up against a house, it's going to fall over a trail, by all means take it down. What I'm talking about is trying to encourage you to select maybe a tree that you'd like to, a live tree that you might remove because it might create a little opening or allow some sunlight to the forest floor for management reasons, but to cut that tree down for your firewood instead of the dead trees. Cut that tree down, and then you're going to have to age the wood or let it dry for a year or two before you use it. But if you can get yourself on a rotation where you're doing that, starting that process now, you would leave these dead trees. So lots of different mammals, over 70 species of birds, mammals, and amphibians in Wisconsin will utilize snags or dead trees. A recommendation, 6 snags per acre. And if you don't have any snags right now on the property and you're interested in this, you can actually girdle a tree, which is essentially killing the tree. You would cut through the bark layer all the way around the tree, maybe 2 or 3 inches in height of bark that you would remove, and basically that prevents nutrients from getting to the tree and it will slowly start dying. And throughout the dying stages, it will provide homes. Insects will start to infest the tree, and then you'll have birds coming through, and eventually you'll have chickadees or flying squirrels will excavate cavities, and you start utilizing that dead tree or dying tree. If you, again, don't have these trees on your property, you can provide shelter artificially. You can build nest boxes. There's lots of different wildlife species that use nest boxes, from flying squirrels to bats to wood ducks or bluebirds. The information for building these nest boxes is all over. Whether you use a UW Extension publication that I can show you at the end, contact your local DNR office, or search on the internet. The one caution is that sometimes there are better designs than others. When it comes to bats, if you're interested in building a bat house, which is not a nest box, they won't raise their young in it, but they roost in there during the day. The best source of information for building bat houses would be Bat Conservation International, and if you type that in, you would get to their website pretty quickly. So each species has a different dimension and size and shape to the box that has been proven with research to work best. So a lot of people have gotten into building bird houses or nest boxes during the winter and then putting them up in the spring. Other things you can do for cover and shelter, the brush piles. The key to building a good brush pile is to start with a good base. So instead of just throwing the limbs and the tops of the trees in a pile, and then over a couple of years they start to break down, and pretty soon you just have a big pile of crushed twigs and branches, but there's no spaces in the bottom, or an animal couldn't really move around in there very well. The key is to start with good bases. So in the lower left-hand corner you see some 4-foot logs that are crisscrossed, and then what you would do is put those branches on top, so that as those branches break down, you still have some openings for a rabbit, or for some other small mammals or birds to get into some of those spaces and use that as a rest area and be protected from predators. Also, if anybody's interested in attracting reptiles to their property, particularly snakes, I'm sure there are some of you listening that are by no means interested in doing that, but snakes certainly have their utility in terms of controlling small mammal populations. If you have a tree farm, or you're trying to have ornamentals that meadow voles or other small mammals are girdling or killing, having a couple snakes around or attracting snakes to the property can certainly help manage that problem. So if you're interested in attracting snakes, you can build a hibernation mound or a hibernaculum. That's a place where snakes would go during the winter to hibernate. And to do that, there's a schematic in the upper right-hand corner. You can dig a hole or a pit in the ground and put things like, this example has stumps, something large that's going to still again create some gaps, some spaces for the snakes to be, and then backfill it with sand or debris, leaves, things like that. And then you can see that that pile is even above the level of the ground, and basically building some thermal protection there from frost. Amphibians, reptiles, they need to get below that frost line so they can avoid freezing during the winter. Okay, the last habitat component is water. And water, again, obviously is critical for wildlife. They use it for both drinking, and some species will use it for bathing. It can be as simple as a bird bath, or just a saucer or a dish that you might put out in your backyard, or it could be a rain garden or a large pond, or maybe you have a wetland complex or a lake on your property. But as you start to add even aquatic plants, you're going to increase the diversity of wildlife. So if you have a pond versus just a bird bath, you'll attract different species. So if you did decide to do a wetland scrape, or put in a pond, or even just a small landscape pond in the backyard, you'll see an immediate response from wildlife. And if you can make that water moving water, whether you're putting in a little waterfall feature or you have a river or a creek on your property, you'll attract more species there as well. You'll get insects like mosquitoes and dragonflies, and they certainly will serve as a food source for wildlife. So the last habitat requirement was space, and again, every wildlife species has a unique pattern of space, or they have territorial needs. So that meadow vole, meadow voles are very, very common. There's hundreds per acre, but there are some species, whether it's the goshawk or the ruffed grouse or the turkey, that require certain amounts of acres. So a flock of turkeys probably require 40 acres at least. So some wildlife species, you may have to settle for them just simply visiting your property at a given time of the year during their life cycle. So maybe you'll have turkeys in the fall when they're eating acorns, and the acorns are dropping on your ridges, but they might move on and winter somewhere else, or raise their poults or their broods in the spring in somebody else's CRP field or elsewhere. But what you need to keep in mind is that the space doesn't have to be limited to only your property. You can work across boundaries, and you can work with your neighbors, and you can consider trying to doing some more large-scale management with your neighbors for some of these species that have bigger space needs. And I also will just add that with space or territory needs, that's important for you to think about. So if you're interested in managing for ruffed grouse and you own 20 acres and right now you have 1 or 2 grouse on your property, that might be all that your property will ever have. It's not reasonable to have 25 grouse per acre. That's just simply not going to happen. They need more space need more space for individuals. A few other quick principles when we talk about these habitat components. It's also important on the arrangement of these of the food, of the water, of the cover is important, and it's important that it's interspersed to maximize the value to wildlife. So you don't want to have water in the northwest corner of your property and all your food and planting in the southeast. You want to make sure that these components are interspersed, mixed throughout the property. And if you're going to do something like put in a food plot or create a wildlife opening, you also want to think about making sure you put it, there's a better place to put it. If you can put it surrounded by a forest or some good cover or shelter belt, somewhere where wildlife could escape. So wildlife will be attracted to the food, but you want to make sure that they're not doing that with a sacrifice, not making themselves prone to predation while they're out there trying to feed. So good arrangement is important as well. And we talked about planting native plants. Along those lines, it's also important for landowners to start to learn to identify and to control invasive exotic plants on your property. And the reason for this is they provide little value to wildlife, which, okay, fine, maybe wildlife just ignore them and you're going to plant all sorts of native plants. But it's not quite that easy. These plants are invasive and they'll simply replace native plants. So it behooves you to start controlling species like buckthorn or garlic mustard, because when they take over an area it becomes a monoculture and you just won't see the diversity of wildlife. And there's usually no natural predators to control these. So if you have some infestations, it is a good idea to start tackling them as soon as possible. And that's, for another night or another topic, but there's certainly a fair amount of information on managing invasives, and there's a lot of workshops and places for landowners to get that information as well. So what I'd like to do next is move from some of these principles to some timber management practices that you might consider. And I'm just going to touch on clear cutting and selection cutting, and I decided to bring it up because as you manage, if you decide to do either timber stand improvement or some harvesting of your woodlands, there are some things that you might consider in terms of what might benefit wildlife. So if you're going to have a logger come out or you're in the Managed Forest Law program, there's some things, if you're interested in wildlife, that you might want to work into those contracts or make sure that they're aware that you're interested in doing. And next week Tom Steele will be talking with you, and he'll spend more time talking about timber harvesting. So clear cutting is still done. It is a necessary management tool for some wildlife species. If you're interested in ruffed grouse or woodcock or some of the early successional forest species, clear cutting is definitely something that will need to get done to provide that habitat. So as the name implies, it removes all of the trees in a given area, and it's done at one time. Loggers come in, take out all of the trees, and it's used to regenerate trees that require full sunlight. So they can't be shaded out. And it's an even age management, so all of the trees are the same age because they all started in the same year now because they've been harvested. And what happens is these pioneer trees, or the sun-loving trees as they're called, like aspen is the classic example, they'll be the first to sprout back and take over that area. This is the same reason later on when we talk about succession or creating wildlife openings, why you end up fighting with aspen in trying to keep an opening, because aspen wants to respond because they're being influenced by the sun and so on. So clear cutting, it's had a bad reputation. I think more and more folks are starting to understand the value or the utility of clear cutting. The drawbacks are that it is unsightly. And it can potentially be harmful to the environment because it makes the land prone to erosion. There's no trees to stop runoff and collect some of that water during severe storms. So it's not recommended. Like this photo shows a bit of a hillside there. We tend to avoid doing clear cutting on hillsides or highly erodible areas. The positives of clear cutting: deer are attracted to the aspen twig litter left over, and they'll start to browse on the new sun-loving plants that are emerging even in the first year. The new growth, if you come back to this same area in even 2 to 3 years, it will be so thick you will have a very difficult time getting through it. And that thick habitat provides hiding places for deer fawns, for ruffed grouse broods. The #1 predator for the ruffed grouse is the northern goshawk. It's a bird of prey, and they will fly and maneuver and catch a ruffed grouse. But if the grouse is in really thick habitat like 3 to 5-year-old aspen, it would be very hard for that goshawk to get to that grouse. And some wildlife species depend on these young stands for food and shelter. So a few considerations for wildlife if you're going to do some clear cuts. Instead of making just a square, more rigid shaped, you want to use some irregular shapes. It'll also add more edge, and a lot of game species in particularly prefer the edge, and the edge is just the border between the clear cut and the forest that is still standing. So if you can make that clear cut in irregular shape, you'll actually create more edge than if you left it as a square, and that also will help it to make it look a bit more natural, and especially as it starts to grow back, it'll look a little bit more natural too. And for the aesthetics end of things, if you can leave an area uncut near the roadways, either whether it's your driveway or it's a county road where people are looking at the clear cut, that will help create a visual buffer from the harvest. And if you have waterways on your property, it's also a great idea to keep a buffer next to the waterway, an area of trees that you're not harvesting, because this will help keep the soil in place and protect the water from soil erosion. When you're finished with a cutting, whether it is a clear cut or it's a selective cut, any type of logging, you could use those logging roads that are created to take the timber out as roads or a trail system for you to walk or to hunt or to ski on your property. And you can also then go back and seed those logging roads for wildlife, whether you're putting clover in for wildlife or some other food source, you could seed those for wildlife. And again, when you do a timber contract or a harvesting contract, you might ask the logger to leave those dead trees and shrubs standing so that other wildlife species can utilize them instead of knocking them over in the process. They're not going to be utilized for wood or anything, so hopefully they can work with you to leave some of those at least standing. In clear cuts, if you are interested in managing for ruffed grouse, if you have a 40 acres and you want to manage for ruffed grouse and you have aspen, what's important to understand is that ruffed grouse need all different age classes of aspen. Young stands for brood cover, mature stands for food and shelter, and old stands that have an open understory they use for breeding and drumming logs. They need that increased visibility. So to accomplish that, oftentimes what's suggested is kind of a rotational clear-cutting design on those 40 acres, where you might break that into 4 units of 10 acres each, and then in the first year you might harvest 10 acres and then wait 5 to 10 years later and harvest another 10 acres, so that what you end up with is a rotational cutting regime, but it allows you to have 4 10-acre sections that have all different age-classed aspen and allow grouse to be on your property year-round. Selection cutting is the next one I was going to mention, and that is when you simply go in and remove an individual tree or small groups of trees, and this is used to regenerate shade-tolerant species, so they don't need to utilize the sun, but this is a form of uneven age management because you're leaving trees at different ages, and you might do this selection or group selection. Each year you might harvest a few trees, whether you're doing this for firewood or so on. This can provide a variety of food and cover for wildlife, and these small openings, like if you look at the graphic on the bottom under group selection, those small openings will promote new saplings and grasses. As the sunlight hits that forest floor, You'll get raspberries and other brambles that will come in and provide food and cover and an understory for wildlife. Example tree species in this case would be some of the ash, sugar maple, basswood, balsam fir. Some considerations if you're going to do a selection cutting would be to retain a variety of the nut-producing trees. You want to hang on to some of your oaks, hickory, beech, walnut, any of those nut-producing trees. You don't want to go in and harvest all of your oak trees or all of your walnuts. You want to keep a diversity, and it also will help to ensure a consistent food supply. So an individual oak tree will produce acorns once every 3 to 5 years. So by having different species, that will help make sure that there's some nuts available each year. If you want some guidelines, 35 nut trees with 14 inches or more in diameter per acre would be a general guideline to follow. And then also some of the old trees, we call those wolf trees. You want to hang on to those. They're the big, beautiful trees with sprawling branches, and they're usually great nut producers, and they can be great den trees. Turkeys like to roost on their lateral branches. So again, those are nice trees or specimens to leave in the forest. And you also want to protect the seed and berry producing shrubs. So if you have dogwoods or patches of alder or mulberry, you want to work around those and try to keep those patches intact. And again, we talked about leaving the spaces between the trees because that's going to encourage the sunlight to hit the forest floor and encourage shrub and grasses to grow. Okay, the next aspect I wanted to talk about is creating forest wildlife openings. And this is, you can think of this as a food plot. And these openings can provide a good source of food, again, some escape cover for wildlife, whether we're talking about ruby-throated hummingbirds, chipmunks, deer, bear, and what you plant in there is kind of up to you. You could do grassland planting if you have the correct soils. You could do a little grassland restoration, but you could also plant more of an agricultural crop. But any of the flowering annuals or grasses, they're going to start to attract grasshoppers, crickets, and other insects. And that in the middle of a forest is going to start to attract ruffed grouse chicks, turkey poults, and songbird chicks. All of the young in the spring that need high protein diets so they can grow. Before you put in a wildlife opening, it would help to evaluate the surrounding landscape. And what I mean by that is if your neighbor has a bunch of forests and they're already doing some wildlife openings and you're the owner of 40 or 80 acres that is a contiguous block of habitat, you might consider not putting in an opening because some wildlife species require undisturbed blocks of habitat. So goshawks or pileated woodpeckers, they need habitat that's not fragmented, it's not chunked up, they need contiguous blocks. The same is true for some of the grassland species. So if your neighbor's doing wildlife openings, perhaps you want to keep yours intact. If the area surrounding you is all national forest or county land that pretty much has no wildlife openings, doing a few openings might provide that essential food that the wildlife in the area is lacking at the time. If you were going to go about creating a forest wildlife opening, it doesn't have to be big, 1 to 3 acres in size. The shape, we strive for long and narrow. You could do an S or a J shape, something that looks a bit more natural. The key is that the width should be at least 1 to 1.5 times the height of your adjacent trees. So if your adjacent trees are 15 feet tall, you want to make sure that food plot is at least 22 feet wide. And basically that's to help to make sure that you have some sunlight hitting that food plot. The other thing to make sure, or to help you with that, is by your orientation of the food plot. An east to west direction is preferred because that, again, will help you maximize sunlight penetration. And location, as we talked about, the arrangement of your food and cover, you want to put food plots near young evergreen stands if possible, but at the very least you want to have it next to good cover because wildlife will be out there utilizing it. and they need to have some escape cover if predators are nearby. So some of the steps to create a forest wildlife opening: you're going to lay out your boundary and basically harvest all the trees and shrubs that are inside it. You can use some of the materials that you're harvesting or clearing and build brush piles. You're going to remove the stumps and rocks, so that's a great opportunity to build some big rock piles and piles of stumps for habitat. You'll have to disc the site to prepare it for seeding. You'll probably want to do a soil test and decide whether you need to add some lime or fertilizer to the soil, and then you would disc it again to incorporate that material. And then you can plant native grasses. Again, this is more in a grassland setting than a forest setting, but you could plant some of the native grasses, or you could do an agricultural variety, whether you're planting Dutch white clover or some ryegrass. You could also do sorghum strips and things like that. So if you're doing a wildlife opening in northern Wisconsin, those pioneer species like the aspen are going to think you just clear-cutted for them, and they're going to sucker readily, and they're going to start to encroach in that area. So you're going to need to do some things to maintain that opening over time, or what's going to happen is the shrubs and the aspen are going to encroach, and eventually that's going to grow back up and look like a forest again. So if you're trying to maintain it as an opening, you're going to probably have to do some mowing of the brush. So as I talked a bit about evaluating the surrounding landscape and whether or not you wanted to put in a wildlife opening, you also need to decide, and this depends on what species of wildlife you're interested in managing for. Putting in edges or adding fragmentation or roads or food plots, anything like that, is going to help some species, but it's going to hurt other wildlife species. Those edges are going to have a wider variety of food and cover, and you're going to see more varieties of wildlife than either of the habitat alone, either the food plot alone or either the woods alone. That edge area is going to have more wildlife. But there are some negatives of having more edge. Not all wildlife species need edge. Some prefer the interior of large tracts of land. And for these species, as you start to fragment the landscape, you're leaving less space for breeding and nesting, and also could be creating greater threats from predators and parasites, and then more human disturbance in general if you're putting in a trail system or things like that. So these are also things that you'll need to consider and will depend on the species that you're interested in attracting. So this is where the ball gets passed back into your court. You know, as an extension educator, we talk with landowners and we give them information on how to do things, but ultimately the beauty of owning private land is that you get to make the decisions on what you manage for and what techniques or what techniques you implement to obtain those goals. Will you be successful all the time? No. Some of it you'll have to learn the hard way by trying and learning from your mistakes and not being afraid to try again. The other thing to keep in mind is that no matter what you do, you're going to increase some wildlife species and you're going to deter or decrease populations of other species. Even if you go home and you do nothing with your property right now, some species are going to stay there and some will move on as the habitat changes over time. So if you manage for ruffed grouse and you start doing clear cutting, you're going to have some species that will leave, but you're going to attract new species as well. So again, this decision will be up to you. Some people own their property or buy their property, primarily hunters, for a very specific reason. They're interested in either turkeys, white-tailed deer, a very specific species, and that's what their efforts, time, money are towards. Other people will be interested in groups or guilds of species. So we have landowners who are interested in restoring grasslands and are interested in grassland species, grassland birds, grassland mammals, and so on. And some people are simply interested in species richness, and I probably fall into this category, interested in the greatest diversity of wildlife. What techniques can I employ that are going to give me the largest variety of species visiting a property. So, and oftentimes if you're interested in managing for a little, an animal that's not, that doesn't, that is not very abundant is the word I'm looking for, like a pine marten that's endangered or some of the other bird species that are just not abundant in the state, but you want to provide that habitat, oftentimes it's contiguous habitat, then you might be sacrificing diversity to manage for those rare or highly specialized species, and that's perfectly fine too. The next thing I would like to mention as a principle is succession. So as I said, if you go back and do nothing on your property, wildlife are still going to respond, and that is because the forest is always going through successional stages. It's a natural process, and you can either use it to your advantage or it can be a constant battle for you depending on what type of habitat you're trying to maintain. So succession is basically the changing of a biotic community. And as the grassland starts to get encroached by shrubs and saplings, the animal community is going to change. Those grasshopper sparrows and bobolinks and upland sandpipers are no longer going to be interested in the grassland because now there's shrubs in it, and they're not interested in that. But you'll start to see other birds, sparrows, cardinals, robins, things like that will take their place as the shrub and saplings start to develop. And as the shrubs and saplings develop into a mature forest, then you start to get some of the warblers. Grouse will certainly use a mature forest during some of their cycle, bear, red fox, and so on. So what you have to decide is at what successional stage do you want your forest to be currently, or are you willing to allow succession to take over? If you have the wildlife openings, you're going to have to fight succession, and you'll do that by either during a prescribed burn, you'll do some mowing, you can apply some herbicides, and in grassland settings they also utilize grazing to help maintain the pastures or grassland areas from to keep them free of shrubs and saplings. Okay, lastly, the next step would be for you to think about a management plan. Some of you probably have a managed forest law plan. You may or may not have put in some wildlife considerations. You can possibly go back and do that the next time it's reviewed, or if you haven't submitted it yet, you can do that. You can talk to the professionals about that as well. But if you're going to design a wildlife management plan for your property, there's a few steps involved. Certainly setting your objectives, creating a map of your property that you can share with professionals as you seek advice. You also want to inventory the wildlife on your property. You want to find out what wildlife already exists. If you're interested in grouse, how many are there right now? And then you would take these, your objectives, your plan, you would take it and get some advice from wildlifers, foresters, a variety of folks from different agencies even. You would start to finalize and carry out your plan. And then once you started doing some of the habitat management techniques, you're going to want to monitor and evaluate your results, whether it's annually, every 5 years, or so on. So you'd come back and do some of the same wildlife surveys you used to inventory the wildlife to see if you have in fact met your objectives and increased those specific wildlife populations. I think the reasons for creating a management plan are probably pretty obvious, but it is a very good way to define and organize your land use. We really try to get landowners to put a plan in writing so that their heirs to the property know what their intentions are, and it's a great idea to involve family members or whoever the heirs of the property are into the development of the plan. So it also will help you analyze different options, and it allows a landowner the ability to kind of select the best course of action in order for them to achieve their goals. And today's decisions can have a long-term impacts and benefits. So I commend all of you for starting this process, for those of you that are just starting, and for those of you that are attempting to learn and gather even more information. I commend you for doing that. It often isn't easy but it is very rewarding. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the resources that are available that you can use to expand on the information you've heard here. If you're interested in learning about a particular wildlife species that you'd like to attract, there's lots of field guides. The Peterson Field Guide series is a particularly good one. But also, instead of buying a field guide, you can also do some looking on the internet. You just want to make sure that you're looking in the Midwest, and hopefully even in Wisconsin if you can get that specific, so that we're not talking about white-tailed deer management in Texas or Tennessee or somewhere else. So you want to make sure it's relevant to Wisconsin. But there's a lot of wonderful field guides out there as well that will talk about their habitat requirements and their basic ecology. There's another excellent set of publications that's actually available free for you, and it's the Wildlife in Your Land series by the Department of Natural Resources. And Bill and Chris have been talking about the website. It's the same website where you just registered for these webinars, but there'll be a link there that you can get to these materials, and they're available through the Department of Natural Resources. And as I said, you can send an email to them and they can send you a set out. And they're also, I believe they're also available online that you can look at them. But there's 3 of them here that are particularly tied to developing a management plan, and I'm going to advance the slide. And you'll see another 6 of them. Again, it's a 14 publication set. And some of these include things on managing deadwood for wildlife, how to plant food plots, trees, shrubs, and vines that are particularly good for wildlife. And the website, again, there, you can either go to where you registered for this class on the Woodland Owners website, or you can go to the DNR website directly and get to these publications. Also, the University of Wisconsin Extension here in Madison, we have a Learning Store website, and it's learningstore.uwex.edu. That should be showing up on your screen now. And there's a number of publications that we've done here in this department, from landscape plants that attract birds, or building houses and feeders that attract birds and mammals. The publication that much of this information is repeated in and goes into even more in depth is that publication on the far right, A Landowner's Guide to Woodland Wildlife Management. That would be an excellent resource for you to expand on this presentation tonight. And again, these are available as PDFs that you can just simply open up on your computer, read on the computer, or you can print them off. Or if you really want to have the colored version, you can also order them, and they're a couple bucks to get the publication. And also on that same website, the Learning Store website, we didn't talk about wildlife damage management, but oftentimes landowners deal with nuisance wildlife. So I just wanted to let you know that there are a series of publications that address particular problems that wildlife can cause landowners. So that those sets of publications are there as well. And finally, I want to talk to you about a program that I coordinate for the state. It's the Wisconsin Coverts Program, and it is a program geared for wildlife, folks who are interested in managing woodlands for wildlife, private landowners, so exactly the audience that this presentation was for as well. But this would be, instead of 1 hour, you would have 3 days of workshop content, and we have classroom lectures, and we also do field tours and site visits where you get to see firsthand some of this management. We also do some inventory and monitoring techniques, so you'll get a chance to do some small mammal trapping, some bird surveys, reptile and amphibian surveys, but we get you on the land to show you this management and the techniques, some of the habitat improvements that you could consider doing on your property. And then we have experts come in from the various state agencies and organizations to talk about their individual work. So I'll leave this slide up for a second. This is the information, the 2009 workshop, the one that well, I shouldn't say that. Some of you are definitely from out of state. So the first workshop is August 13th to the 16th, and that's for any Wisconsin woodland owner, and it'll be held in Woodruff, Wisconsin. The second workshop is something new this year. We're trying to target some absentee Wisconsin landowners, particularly landowners living in the Chicago area. So if that's you and you're interested in managing your woodlands for wildlife and would like to hear more about this, then you can contact me and I can get you a brochure and an application. So that is all I have. Thank you very much for listening tonight, and we'll talk to Bill and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Jamie. We do have some questions, and I want to leave your slide up a little bit longer in case people are scribbling down the information very quickly. I think the email address is probably the most critical thing that you can get off of that. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is we've got some questions that we'd like to pose to you about this program, and while you're filling out those polls, I'm gonna share some of the questions I've gotten from you guys in the audience with Jamie, and she can respond to those. So hopefully everybody has finished. I'm going to take over the screen again. So while we're going through these, I'm going to launch a poll for you to respond to. And then when you've clicked your response, please type in a question if you have some for Jamie, and we'll respond to those. So here's the first question while you're filling out the poll. Jamie, someone asks, what happened to the whippoorwill in the Wausau area? I have not heard them in years.
That's a very common observation in the last couple of years, and probably even beyond that. But we've had calls about folks that were concerned about the lack of whippoorwills, and I think it's likely an issue of habitat. Their habitat has requirements are no longer being met, and there just are not as many whippoorwills as what there once was. I guess I'd have to even myself look into a little bit more about their habitat requirements, but I think it likely has something to do with habitat fragmentation and just lack of food, maybe not so much food as cover, or just habitat in general.
Okay. Let's jump to the next poll question. And the next question we have for you, Jamie, is any particular trees and shrubs I should encourage or plant for ruffed grouse?
Well, ruffed grouse are going to do real well with those berries, chokecherries, nannyberries. It would again be something that I guess I would recommend looking into one of the textbooks. I apologize, I don't have the information memorized for all of the almost probably 500 species we have in the state, but I would be going right to a food source book as well, wildlife plants and foods resource book. But you can also, you can get that from the Ruffed Grouse Society as well. They would have suggestions on trees and shrubs to plant, and particularly in this region that would do well. You could also look in the field guide, but a lot of your berry producing shrubs would do well.
Okay, I got some more questions and another poll for everybody. Please fill out the poll. Here's another question. Are badgers extirpated?
No, badgers are definitely not extirpated. But it's very interesting. We're the badger state, and yet we really do not have a good population estimate as to the number of badgers. They are a protected species. They may not be hunted or trapped, but we don't have a good idea of how many badgers are in the state. So they're found throughout the state, and they're preying primarily on small mammals. They're excellent diggers, so they're preying on small mammals. I did some research. My master's research was in grassland systems in southwestern Wisconsin, and I spent 3 summers every day in the field, and I saw 2, and those are the only 2 badgers I've seen with all the time that we spend in in the field, but in talking with some of the landowners, they see them pretty frequently. So the farmers do see them, and the Department of Natural Resources, I believe, still collects information from their biologists or from citizens that report sightings on their rare mammal observation form that they have. So they do exist. I have a feeling their populations are doing, pretty well, but we just have not done research or, a census to know exactly how many we have, but they do exist.
Okay. I've got one more poll question, and another question for you, Jamie. In the last few years, we've had bears appear on our property. What should we do about them?
So if it was me, I probably wouldn't do anything about them other than to take down bird feeders and make sure that my garbage was just the area around my house. I wasn't attracting them closer to the house or to the garage by leaving food out or feeding dogs outside, anything that would be putting a food source to attract them closer to the building. By nature, black bears are scared of humans. If you see a bear in the woods, they're gonna run the other way. They're gonna be just as scared of you, if not more, as you may be of them. So I would take precautions around the house to make sure that you have food and attractants put away, and other than that, I mean, personally, I guess I started the answer with, I might not do anything because I would like to see them, but again, just taking bird feeders down, they get attracted to the bird feeders and will come in and use that as a food source. So doing what you can to not bring them into the vicinity of your house and just observing them from a distance would be great.
Okay, that's our last poll question. I've got one more question for you, Jamie, and then we'll cut you loose. Is it likely that West Nile contributed to whippoorwill decline?
That's a good question. I haven't been on the CDC website in this year to see if they've been affected with West Nile virus, but my hunch would be that that is not the reason. And if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to do some more digging on that. I know that that's a question that's been posed before, and I can do some looking to see if they have some more specific justification or reasons why those populations have declined. But I do suspect that it's habitat related. The West Nile virus really tends to impact more the corvid species, the bluebirds and the crows. And it certainly has affected other bird species, but not to a level that I think would cause declines like we've seen. So I have a feeling it's mostly habitat related.
Okay, Jamie, let me pose one more question to you. It's kind of a two-parter, but the question is, how good is birch for wildlife, and is there some trees better for to create snags out of than others? You said you could create your own snags. So how good is birch for wildlife, and which trees are better for creating snags?
Well, birch can be real good for wildlife, and it can be good for wildlife in that they have a pretty short lifespan when you consider tree species. So once they start dying, even 30, 40, 50 years in, they start to be really prime species. They have a soft wood, so they're targeted species for woodpeckers and other birds that are foraging for insects. So, and then as far as snags, if you were going to girdle trees, so that publication on critter condos that was in that Wildlife in Your Land series, they'd recommend girdling or utilizing snags or keeping dead trees of a variety of different species and diameters. So whether it's a small birch tree or a large dead oak tree, both of those have the potential to provide habitat for a different array of wildlife. Again, the birch tree as a snag is going to provide soft wood or fiber for insects to burrow into and again then feed wildlife. And it also is an easy tree for smaller birds to excavate cavities, whether it's a chickadee or some of the cavity nesting species and they're small little birds that could utilize a small diameter tree for a nest site. Then when you think about the larger oak trees, they tend to have heart rot, where they rot from the inside out, and they are going to be a harder wood species, and they'll be the ones that are more apt to have that hollow center and then provide a spot for either an owl to roost or to nest, or raccoon to spend some time during the day, species like that. So the answer to your question is it could be any kind of species, and having some variety again with your snags will also attract more diversity of wildlife.
Great. Well, thanks, Jamie. That takes us to the end of our this webinar. I appreciate everybody hanging out to the end, and these some great questions we got. And I appreciate, Jamie, you giving the presentation. Did a great job, and we had a lot of good questions, and your answers were just fantastic, if I can say so myself. So with that, we're going to end the session. I appreciate everybody's participation, and we hope you enjoyed it. And next week, we're going to have tax issues for woodland owners. And Tom Steele will be talking about timber harvesting and sales on February 4th. So next week is tax issues, same time, same place. Good evening, everybody, and safe travels.